Well, good morning. Those of you who are in the room this morning, this is a back to basics session covering key herbaceous invasive plants, including that infamous giant hogweed and lesser known species. In the UK, a wide range of invasive plants require the attention of surveyors and professionals working within the industry, while Japanese Knotweed often dominates discussions. Confidence in identifying key legislative changes for these invasive plants is crucial for effective management and prevention. Now, our online webinar this morning is literally going back to the basics and with invasive herbaceous plants. And our presenter this morning is Robert Mitchell from Conservation Land Services, and I'd like to hand over the platform to Robert this morning. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you. Welcome, everybody. As Andrew said, this is a brief introduction into some more troublesome invasive herbaceous plants, but I've said particularly for commercial sites, because by that I mean for any of your clients who have responsibility for land, be it development site or a school or any public access land, because some of the plants we're going to discuss this morning have an impact on people's health and well-being. So the plants we're going to be looking at this morning are Giant Hogweed, Hemlock Water Dropwort, Variegated Yellow Archangel, and Field Horsetail. Now, these plants are just some of the plants that we look at in considerably more detail in the PCA Herbaceous Invasive Plants course that there will be a link for at the end of this morning. And that next session is going to be in March, April next year. But in that course, we look into all of this in considerably more detail. And we actually look at some more plants on top of these as well. So let's make a start. So giant hogweed, Heracleum mantigasianum. Now, I'm aware there's quite a few people out there who don't like using the Latin terminology. I'm quite keen on this, and I'm hoping that'll become clear as we go through this morning, because we will be looking at Field Horsetail at the end, and that's a classic example. By using the Latin, you are then completely clear. Everyone has no confusion whatsoever about which plant you're discussing. But more than that, if you are aware of some other plants within the same family, so although you don't know how to specifically control that one plant that you've come across, because you're aware of it being part of the same family, you will now have some understanding about its life cycle and about how to put together something of an idea of how a control program might work. Anyway, giant hogweed. This is a massive, often monocarpic perennial herb. Monocarpic means, a monocarpic plant means that it will die. It will flower. Then once it's flowered, it dies. Okay? So it's that sort of thing that's really useful to know about when you're looking at control programs. So it's a monocarpic perennial herb, mainly naturalized along rivers and stream sides, but you will also find it in derelict gardens, woodland clearings, neglected urban places, waste ground, refuse tips, roadsides, abandoned pastures and arable field margins. Essentially, you will find it everywhere, but it's more common to find it along riparian environments. So there we have, there's a map showing the spread of the plant, and it's my view that, like in many of these invasive weeds, the only reason why there's some gaps on that map is because someone hasn't walked all the way out there to find it. But it spreads prolifically and it spreads by seed. So by having that understanding that it's by seed, you can straight away start to get an understanding as to when you put your control program together, you're going to be focusing on preventing it from forming a seed. And it forms massive colonies where it's allowed to generate. Now, giant hogweed, the legislation for giant hogweed has recently changed. It used to be on the Wildlife and Countryside Act of 1981, but getting on for a couple of years ago now, it's now been moved on to the Invasive Alien Species Enforcement and Permitting Order of 2019. And it's important to be aware of these legislation changes because there is a significant difference between the Wildlife and Countryside Act and the order. There are many similarities, but the order is considerably easier for government agencies to pursue with an order. Under that, I'm not aware of anyone who's been prosecuted under the Act. It's really difficult. But because it's an order, it makes it much, much simpler to prosecute someone. And so if you've got responsibility for advising somebody, or you've got responsibility for land, whereas you might have been able to get away with it in the past by making the argument it's not spreading beyond your boundary, now it's on the order. You've got to be aware, you've got to get onto it, and you've got to do something about it. So brief introduction to the life cycle. As we've already mentioned, it's monocarpic, and it produces, and its reproduction is by seed. So it's biennial. So what that means is that it takes at least 2 seasons to get to a point where it's mature enough to produce a flower head. And then it's in that second and sometimes the third season that it will produce seed. And the flowers normally appear between June and August. And after producing seed, as we've already mentioned, it dies. So knowing that it's likely to produce flowers between June and August, you need to be jumping on that before June to break the life cycle. But do remember, everything about this plant is massive. So it only spreads by seed. There's no vegetative reproduction with this plant. The seed bank is usually very shallow, but massive numbers of seed. Everything about this plant is massive. So it's about 2,000 viable seeds per square meter. So you can see straight away, you like most invasive weeds, you need to get on it very, very quickly. Because if you delay by 1 season, you've got 2,000 seeds per square meter already, more new plants ready to go. And unusually, although it's giant hogweed, the seeds are normally within the first 5 centimeters of the soil, but they can lay dormant for many years. Okay, so once control has been achieved, you need to be continually observing because you still got a potential plant lying in the ground ready to regenerate. So if we said already, everything about this plant is absolutely massive, and it probably is the largest herbaceous plant in the UK. In the stems can be anywhere between 3 and 5, over 5 meters. Once you've seen your first plant, you will know you cannot confuse it. It is absolutely massive. Now the stems are heavily grooved. They're hollow and they're hairy, and they often have a reddish stain, mostly towards the base of the plant. But again, the stem is massive, anywhere between 5 and 10 centimeters or more across. But I would just add at this point, do make sure, and we'll come across it in a minute, do make sure that if you're anywhere near this plant, you've got full PPE. You've covered your hands, you've covered everything, because that we will come across that in a minute, but that is the issue with this plant. Do not touch it. The leaves are irregularly serrated, and again, massive, often a meter. I've sometimes seen them almost 2 meters long. Really, really big. So it's considered by the Environment Agency and many others as probably the second most undesirable plant after Japanese knotweed. It's one that you all really need to be very aware of. But this is the issue. It causes severe blistering. So it's really important. One, to be aware of this, so that if you've got people responsibility for land and you've got the giant hogweed, that is the issue. Not only is it invasive, but it causes damage to human health. So you need to be restricting access to it. You need to be making sure that no one goes anywhere near it. And this severe blistering is particularly evil, actually, because let's say you got contact with it this year, even though you won't be in contact with it next year or the year after, you will still get blistering of the skin. All right, it's horrible, and people need to be aware of the seriousness of it. So we're now moving on to our next plant, hemlock, Conium maculatum. And like giant hogweed, this is another one of the umbellifer or carrot family, and which is a huge family. But being aware that it's an umbellifer, it's useful because you will know that the giant hogweed has got that slightly umbrella-like shape to the flower head. So similarly, all the other umbellifers do too, and typically, more often than not, have white or cream flowers. So the thing with hemlock, Conium maculatum, it is extremely poisonous. So although giant hogweed can give rise to serious blistering of the skin, the health issues with hemlock is it's extremely poisonous if ingested. So it's invasive and poisonous if ingested, and that's poisonous to both humans and livestock. And so that presents a serious health issue, particularly where there's public access to a site. And there, I've said here, no notable explosion of hemlock. Absolutely, there has. And I think the Highways Agency people are just about getting onto it now. But as you drive around the country, once you know what hemlock looks like, you will see it absolutely everywhere. And there's been a very significant explosion and distribution of hemlock. And so another example, once it's on a piece of land that you have responsibility for, get on it and get on it very, very quickly. But the hemlock's interesting because it's an example of a plant that's known as a non-native archaeophyte. And what that means is it was introduced in ancient times. Okay, so although it's not classified as invasive non-native species and it's not on Schedule 9, it's native to Europe, but this is an example of one of the troublesome herbaceous invasive plants that we have that's not on Schedule 9, but you still need to do something about it and you still need to be aware of it. It's not just plants that are on Schedule 9. It's biennial, so as like giant hogweed. So what does that mean? That means it's going to take at least 2 seasons before it gets to a point where it's flowering and producing seed. And again, like giant hogweed, it's only reproduced by seed. So that's useful to know. It means you need to be looking to, when you're looking for part of your control plan, looking to break that life cycle, stop it from producing seed. And for those who know Japanese knotweed, hemlock is just like Japanese knotweed in that it has this zigzag stem growth. And you can get really tall stems, I mean, 2 meters or more easily. And it's makes it very distinctive for you to identify it, particularly, actually, strangely, at this time of year, where if you go out and you see these 2.5 meter tall cream zigzag stems above everything else, it actually makes it quite simple to identify. In the growing season, the stems are smooth and they're glabrous. Glabrous means they don't have any hairs. And then there's also this very distinctive blotchy purple patches that you'll find on it, particularly towards the base. And that's really helpful to when you're trying to identify it. So you've got a really tall plant, zigzag form, and these in the summer, these purple patches towards the base. And then, as I've already mentioned, in the winter, As you can see there, the really distinctive cream white appearance, but the purple blotches go black. So if you want to do a double, just to doubly make sure you've got it right, you should find little black blotches on the stem. But it's this very distinctive, very tall zigzag cream stems that you'll once you've got your eye on, it's really easy to identify. And then the leaves are really finely divided leaves. They look like ferns. For any of you who watch rugby or are keen on rugby, I always say to people, think about the All Blacks and their logo, that fern-like logo. That's the shape of the leaves. And they're found all the way up the stem. Okay. So, and then, as we've already mentioned, hemlock is one of the Umbellifer family. And so you get these umbrella-like flower heads, and they're cream in color, and appear anywhere between May through to July. But I would say, actually, with all the mix-up in the seasons we're getting now, I start to see it before May. I've certainly this year. Okay, so this is an example of why it's useful to know the Latin, because we're now coming on to Hemlock Water Dropwort. Now, hemlock, if you remember, is Conium maculatum. Hemlock Water Dropwort is Oenanthe crocata. So by understanding the Latin, it'll help you understand they're two completely separate plants. Yes, they both begin with hemlock, but Hemlock Water Dropwort, Oenanthe crocata, is a completely separate plant. And that's why it's really useful to have an understanding of these Latin names. And it's probably the most poisonous plant to be found in the United Kingdom. It's native to Europe. So again, it's not classified as an invasive native species, non-native species. It's not on Schedule 9 of the Wildlife Countryside Act. But it's a plant that you really must be aware of, particularly if you have riparian environments. In other words, any water. It's a difficult one because it has an unspecialized plant. So it's a very useful for pollinators because any pollinator can use it. But it is really important to be aware of it because it is the most poisonous plant to be found in the UK. Yeah, and the way to remember it is in classic times, Sardinia, the condemned prisoners were executed using Hemlock Water Dropwort. And what happens is, unfortunately, it's a really horrible way to die. The body shuts down from the outside in. The last thing to go is your brain, and it leaves the poor victim in an extreme spasm. And one of the results of that is a very exaggerated grin on their face, which is where the term sardonic grin is probably came from. So, Hemlock Water Dropwort, as I said, it's found in all riparian or wet, damp places, both woodland and grassy areas. It used to be mostly in the south and southwest, but that's no longer the case. It's spreading all over the country, and it's notable. I started to find it in the Midlands about 5 years ago. It's over on the East Coast now, so it's pretty much everywhere now. So it's a glabrous perennial. Glabrous meaning it's hairless, so that's a useful thing to be aware of. And perennial meaning that it'll live for more than 2 years. Now, the above ground vegetation does die back during the winter, but one of the things is that in the winter, you will also still see it. It's a bit strange because the growth from the summer, from this summer, will die back and it'll all go brown and floppy. But you will also find next year's growth alive and well along the riverbank. So the winter time can be quite a useful time to have a little walk to see if you can identify it, because it's one of the very few vibrant plants in the winter, vibrant green. So the seed production is following flowering in June and July. And again, it's another one of the umbellifers family. So it's an umbellifer. So once again, I'm going to keep saying it. You get this umbrella-like form and during the flowering season, and you get these typical white flowers, again, between June and July, and a lot of them. Once you've seen a stand of Hemlock Water Dropwort, there's absolutely masses and masses and masses of flower heads. And I've said to you already, during the winter, the Hemlock Water Dropwort is one of the few plants that remain active. So this is quite a useful slide here, because do you see, I'm not sure if you can see my pointer, but on the left-hand side, you can see the dead brown grey remains of this season's growth. But over there in the shallow water is that vibrant green. It looks like celery. Vibrant green growth, and that's the next season's growth. So that's a really good example of what you can find at this time of year if you're trying to see whether or not you have got Hemlock Water Dropwort. So the stems are grooved. It can make it look like celery, and the stems can grow quite tall, about 1.5 meters. And as we've already said, they're hairless. But you can see there in that image there. You can see how people relate to it as being looking a little bit like celery. And the leaves are can look a bit like, if you looked, bit like flat leaf parsley, if that means anything to you, but it's very distinctive. You look like parsley-like leaves with a celery-like stem, which helps you identify it. And sadly, it can be these leaves can be confused for wild coriander or wild parsley, and that's a very bad thing. Not so much in this country, but in other countries where there's lots of foraging, that's how people think that this is wild celery or wild parsley, and they pick a few of the leaves, put it in their salad, and that's the last thing they do. And if you dig it up, it has this distinctive collection of tubers at the bottom, often referred to as, and it sort of looks like this, as dead man's fingers. And there's a reason why it's called dead man's fingers. It's really, really poison. There's no recovery from this. If you eat this, there's no recovery. And sadly, that's where people confuse it. When they dig it up, they confuse it for wild parsnip. So we now come on to Variegated Yellow Archangel, which is one of the Lamium galeoptilum. Now, the reason why I've put this in here is that it is on Schedule 9, and it often gets neglected. I often, when I'm asked to do surveys, following up from where previous other people have done surveys, typically for Japanese knotweed, and within 10 minutes, I'll be finding Variegated Yellow Archangel, and people they either don't know about it or they haven't spotted it. But it's extremely invasive, but equally really easy to control. But it's a good one to be aware of. So it's evergreen, so it's easy to find. It's at any time of year, and you get these long, vigorous stolons, and typically find them in woody, shaded areas. Base of hedges, that sort of thing. It can grow in a variety of soils, and riverbanks occasionally, but it's mostly roadside verges, woodland edges, and base of hedgerows. You'll find it. Stolon, by the way, if you think of strawberries, and you know how strawberry will throw out stolons, that's what stolons are. And it's on, as I've already said, it's Schedule 9 on the Wildlife and Countryside Act, and as you can see there, it's widely distributed all over the country. So as we've mentioned, it's an evergreen and it's a low-growing herbaceous perennial. And it can quickly generate thick, low-lying mats of the variegated yellow archangel. And it is extremely invasive. It's spread by stolons, and you can see there in the image there an example of how it'll, if you think of strawberries, it'll throw out a stolon, and then where it touches the ground, it generates a new set of roots and a new plant, and that's how it spreads. Again, yes, and as with other invasives, and I'm sure many people who are watching this will know about the Japanese knotweed, but also bamboo as well. Although we're not talking about rhizomes with this, we're talking about, but a fragment of the stolon can result in a new plant, providing there's at least one viable node on there. So it's important to be aware of that. This throwing out of the stolons is its main method of spreading. So it's a really easy one to identify. If you know what nettle looks like, and if you think that someone's gone along and tipped a load of silver white paint over a bunch of nettles, you're halfway there. And then you get these very distinctive yellow flowers, hence variegated yellow archangel. They flower between April through to September. And you can see there in that image, you've got quite a nice example of both the flower and the variegated leaf. So as I've mentioned, they do look a little bit like nettle leaves, but they're variegated. And they had these large, distinctive white markings. Well, I say white, it's silvery white, arranged in opposite pairs. The leaves remain variegated throughout the year. It's an evergreen and are hairy and pointed. If you crush them, you can get this sort of acrid smell, but you shouldn't need to do that. Once you've got your eye in, it's a very easy plant to identify. And there you can see there's quite a thick mat of it there on a woodland floor, and you can see this very distinctive silver white patterning, which is very regular. It's a very regular shape to that patterning, and it quickly outcompetes native woodland flora. So it's not to be confused with the native yellow archangel, okay? And the way to it's quite simple. If it's not variegated, it's not variegated. Okay, it's not variegated yellow archangel. All right, it's not very common, but do just have a quick check when you're looking at it. You've got that white flower, you've got that nettle leaf. But if it hasn't got the variegation, then it's the native. Right, we're finishing now with field horsetail, and this is one of my pet things that makes me which I get quite upset about. You often hear people talk about mare's tail, which is fine. But field horsetail is not mare's tail. And this is where having an understanding as to the Latin terminology is really, really helpful. Field horsetail is Equisetum arvensi, and is very rarely found anywhere near water. You can find it near water, but it's not common, hence field horsetail. Mare's tail is Hipparus vulgaris and is a completely separate aquatic plant. So having that little bit of knowledge is extremely helpful, so that when you're helping someone, be it a commercial site or residential, and they refer to its mare's tail, you can just gently say to them, no, mare's tail is a completely separate plant. That's Hipparus vulgaris. Equisetum arvensi is field horsetail, and it's important to be aware they are two separate plants. So I say long-lived, and that kind of makes me laugh, really, because I'm sure many of you are aware field horsetail has been in this country for millions of years. Dinosaurs grazed on it. That's useful to bear that in mind as well when you're considering control programs. It's notoriously difficult to control, and it can be achieved, but do be aware it's been here for millions of years, and it's going to be here for millions of years after we've gone. It's vigorous. It's resistant to most herbicides, but that's because it's a primitive plant. Okay, we're talking. So all the herbicides that are currently used are designed for modern plants. In other words, post-Ice Age. Field horsetail is a dinosaur. It's a primitive plant, and it has a completely different physiology. And that is why the herbicides struggle to control it, along with the fact that it has very little leaf area. It's a very very tiny leaves. You will find it everywhere. It's absolutely everywhere. Roadsides, railways, paths, soil banks. It will tolerate just about any soil condition. But this is it. It's rhizomal. So like Japanese knotweed, little rhizome fragments is all you need for the plant to be spread. So it presents in two different forms. In the early part of spring, you'll get this finger-like spore that appears from the ground. And you'll see on the right-hand side there's an example of that. Now, the problem with controlling field horsetail is that is the spore stage. And there's no leaf, there's no way you can spray that. The only stage that then does have some form of primitive leaf is later on in the summer, when you get this very distinctive bottle brush type green growth that you see there on the left hand side, but by which time all the spores have been spread. And so that's part of the problem with field horsetail. And as you can see there from the distribution map, you will find it everywhere. It is absolutely everywhere. So how do we identify it? Well, in the summer, it's very distinctive. You've got this single vertical jointed hollow stem, which actually does it extracts silica. It's actually full of silica. And in the old days, some forms of horsetail were used because of that silica. Were used for cleaning pots and pans. And you get this. Well, I refer to it as an old-fashioned loo brush. But you get this whirl of green branches radiating from that stem with that very distinctive little black teeth markings on the stem. It's highly invasive, really, really invasive. And the key problem for both residential and commercial environments, it makes an absolute mess of tarmac. And it results in a lot of very expensive damage to tarmac, but also any other porous material. So by porous material, I mean anything like, MOT type 1, typically used for base for putting down paving. It will push right through it. And it's also toxic to livestock, both live and cut. So we've come to the end of our presentation, and there's a little advert there for the International Invasive Weed Conference that's coming up at the Slate University, which will the PCA, you will find on the PCA website all the information there. And I think we're now coming to our question and answer session. So I'm hoping that Andrew's there. Andrew?
Yes, I'm here. Thanks very much, Robert, for that fine presentation. We've got a few minutes just to take any questions which you may have. Please put the questions on the chat, and I'll introduce them to Robert. But I've got one for myself. You've shown us several maps of different types of invasive weeds. Are these limited to the low-lying regions of the UK? And are they...
the distribution maps?
Sorry? The distribution maps, that's right, yeah. Do they grow in particular soil types?
Which plant? You mean...
Yeah, generally.
Okay, well, the field horsetail will grow in any soil type. Giant hogweed will grow in any soil type. I don't think there are any of the invasive plants that don't grow in just about any soil type, which is part of the problem. I mean, that's why they're so invasive. They will tolerate anything, absolutely anything. I can't think of any of the invasives that are limited to their soil type. There is some discussion about field horsetail, but that's been disproved. Field horsetail will grow in any soil type. So no, they'll tolerate any soil types.
Thank you. Yeah. So they'll even grow up on higher levels. Very hilly areas.
Yeah. As I mentioned, Hemlock Water Dropwort, and to a lesser extent, Giant Hogweed prefer riparian wet environments, and you're less likely to find Hemlock Water Dropwort in dry conditions, but it's not limited by the soil type.
Thank you. Yeah, and also, are any of these, because you say there's a prolific spread of all of these invasive plants? Do you think that's due to climate change? Because in some cases you said that they would die off in winter time.
Yeah, no, I do. So, as I mentioned with the Hemlock Water Dropwort, it used to be, when I first started years ago, it used to be that Hemlock Water Dropwort was just considered a southwest issue. South Wales, Somerset, Devon, Cornwall, that sort of thing. But now you'll find it everywhere, absolutely everywhere. And that's happened in the last 8 years. Hemlock, in the last 9-10 years has exploded everywhere. Yes, I think milder winters has definitely, well, I can't say definitely because I'll have to prove it, but milder winters has I feel made it more conducive for certainly Hemlock Water Dropwort to break out of the southwest, and now you'll find it in Birmingham, Leicester, everywhere.
Yeah, so it's saying effectively in cold conditions they will just shrink back basically, but we don't have those sort of conditions now in the UK.
I think the issue is the summary is that all these invasive, assume you're going to find it. Don't think just because you're in East Anglia you don't have to worry about it.
Right, thank you.
Be live to the possibility of it being on your land and know what it looks like.
Brilliant. So yeah, we're not getting any questions coming through, so I think
that's fine.
Yes.
That either means it was useless or it was comprehensive. Anyway,
I will go for the latter. It was very comprehensive, so because I'm not a knotweeder or anything like that, so so it's been very interesting to me. So it's and of course, in the job that I do, it's also important that I look at vegetation in various things. So that's been very useful. So,
if there are no questions, I would just say thank you to everybody who's jumped on this morning's webinar. Please, if you found it interesting or you want to know more about these plants or you want to know more about herbaceous invasive plants so that you can spread your offering as to the plants that you're able to consider controlling for clients. Do think about joining us for the more comprehensive course that's be in the spring. I think there are a couple of questions there, Andrew.
They've just come through, yeah.
So Gary Andrews has said, can you give a summary of control options for hemlock, please? Yes, Gary. Hemlock spreads by seed. So the key to gaining control with hemlock is to break the life cycle, is to prevent it from coming into flower, and then being aware that there will be previous seasons dormant seeds lying in the ground. They're going to grow, so just keep stopping them from coming into flower, and you will break that life cycle. Russell Clements, one question. So if you find any of these species, what advice should you give? So Russell, forgive me, I'm not quite clear on the question, but the key, I think the key is, the advice is, get on it straight away. I'm sure you're all aware that classic parabolic curve with all invasive species. Initially, you don't get much spread, but after a certain period of time, you get this parabolic growth. And so the key is to get on it as quickly as possible to prevent the problem becoming out of control. Yes. So, Rashid, can you say again at what stage the giant hogweed will seed? Yes. It takes at least 2 years for the plant to get to a maturity to flower, sometimes 3 years. But again, that's a really good example of jumping on it really early. You know, as soon as you think you've identified the plant, don't wait for it to come into flower. Get on top of it, spray it, dig it out, whatever, and break that life cycle. Is there a difference between field horsetail and horsetail? Malcolm, there are many different forms of horsetail. There are many species of horsetail. I think in this country we've got about 9 different species of horsetail, but the one that's most common is field horsetail. All right, we understand re-preventing flowering has glyphosate. Yes, Gary. Yeah, but I'm not a VAS qualified, so as I'm sure you're aware, I can't provide you advice about chemicals, but all I can say to you is yes. Jenny, if you do come across these plants, it would be good for the sighting to be reported through, yes, the INS mapper. Thank you, Jenny. That's a good suggestion. Jenny was just saying, making us all aware about the INS mapper. I'm sure if you look on your do a Google search, you'll find all about that. Yes, so Jenny's just saying reporting these sightings means that the records will be available on the NBN Atlas and will add to the understanding of where they are. I totally agree, Jenny, and thank you for reminding us all about that. It's an important thing for us all to do. We don't do it enough, and once you've got the INS mapper, the iRecord app as well, just takes a couple of minutes, and it's a valuable thing for us all to be adding to that information. So, Jenny, thank you for that. Yeah.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a very interesting webinar this morning. We thank Robert for his presentation, and we thank you for your questions, because they're all important. So thank you. So we're going to close the webinar now.
Andrew, very quickly, Dewey Davis, does it have an effect on property resale value? Okay, so the one that has the potential most impact is the one that everybody is aware about, is Japanese Knotweed. But it's more about having a corporate responsibility to preventing these from spreading from your land. That's the legislation you need to be worried about. It's more about you have a responsibility to ensure that these things are put under control and don't spread beyond your property. Okay, I hope that's helpful.
Brilliant, and we will conclude. We will conclude on that.
All right.
Just to remind everybody, those who are there, the International Invasive Weed Conference is being held shortly, and all details are on the website.
November, Andrew, 28th of November, the Slate.
At the Slate University of Warwick. Yeah. So I'll leave that with you, and thank you very much. And
bye-bye.
Everyone.